Well, the military showing off its new warplanes in a drill with South Korea. The 5 days of simulated war drills involve bombers, fighters, thousands of troops. Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, they condemned it. They call it a prelude to nuclear war. This all comes less than a week after the NOCOs launched their most advanced launch missile to date. John Bolton is the former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, and he joins us now. Same old question. Is it not the case that we have a choice to make? We can accept a nuclear North Korea, or we can knock them out, and that's the choice. Is that it?
I think that's essentially it, barring some dramatic development from China in the wake of the president's recent visit. We haven't seen anything coming from China. We don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but absent dramatic action by China, we have to decide whether we're going to live up to what the president said in his speech to the UN in September, where he said denuclearization is the only way forward with North Korea. So they can either do it peacefully, which isn't going to happen, or we can use military force, because the risk to the United States and our friends of a nuclear North Korea outweighs the risks of a preemptive strike.
Does it start with us shooting down any and all missiles that they shoot out?
I think that should go without saying. I think we have to decide, and it may be that we're in the preparatory stages, for an attack on their nuclear facilities, their ballistic missile facilities, suppressing their artillery north of the demilitarized zone to try and prevent retaliation against innocent South Korean civilians in Seoul. It's a very complex operation. Honestly, we should have done this years ago, but we are where we are.
You think that do you think this country wants appeasement?
No, I don't think it does. And I think, let's face it, it's not just North Korea. North Korea will sell their nuclear and ballistic missile technology to anybody with money, Iran, terrorist groups, you name it. So I don't think living with the threat is acceptable.
Okay, now we just got word that there is no Brexit deal yet. Theresa May has been meeting with the EU Commissioner Jean-Claude Juncker. They just finished their meeting. They say they need more consultation time. This is running into a brick wall, isn't it, this Brexit, getting the Brits out of the European Union?
Well, I think it requires some leadership from Theresa May. I think her response to Mr. Juncker and the others in Brussels is to say, fine, we're prepared to crash out of this with no deal. And by the way, that means you don't get 40 billion pounds as an exit payment. You're going to get a border on between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and a lot of other things you don't want. The only way to get the Brussels bureaucrats and the political theologians of the European Union to wake up to reality is basically to say, I don't care whether you agree with us or not, we're out of here.
But does she have the strength, the political strength, to say that?
If she doesn't have the political strength to say it, I think it's hard to see how she's going to remain prime minister much longer. This is a critical point. The Brits have voted to leave the European Union. They can either do it the right way or they can screw it up. And they're beginning to run out of time, too.
Ambassador Bolton, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
New details now. The U.S. and South Korea have kicked off a massive show of force while taking part in war drills, all in the wake of North Korea test firing their most powerful missile ever. Of course, we know that happened last week, that ICBM. North Korea is also calling out President Trump, saying that the U.S. would be held responsible if the world, quote, is embroiled in the crucible of nuclear war, end quote. Back from the outnumbered show is Ambassador John Bolton here. They use words like crucible and so on over there. But what does it all mean? I mean, you have told me this comes down to a binary choice. Are we actually there now?
I think we're almost certainly there, unless there's some dramatic development from China. North Korea is not going to back away. It's so close to the finish line now after 25 years of effort. It's determined to cross it. We know the president raised this point with Xi Jinping in his visit to Beijing. There's no evidence the Chinese have changed anything yet. So if the president sticks with what he said at the UN, which is denuclearization is the only way forward with North Korea, and I think that's the correct policy, military force follows.
You know, it's been a couple decades ago, but and maybe it's happened since and I wasn't aware of it, but China has turned off energy for North Korea in the past and brought them to they've capitulated quickly, brought them to the table. Why don't they do that now?
Well, there's some question exactly what China did in the past, but the reality is that China does supply over 90% of North Korea's energy needs, large amounts of food and other humanitarian supplies, and that's why China does have it within its power either to bring the regime down and reunify the peninsula or put in its own puppet. They have not done that. Over 25 years of saying they don't want North Korea to have nuclear weapons, they have not exercised the leverage they uniquely have.
Do we know where the president wants to go on this?
Well, I don't think we do. I don't think he's made a final decision. I think any use of force is going to take an enormous amount of preparation. Lindsey Graham said yesterday, I've been saying it for a couple months, we ought to order the departure of all civilian dependents from our military forces in South Korea. We ought to order the departure of families of U.S. embassy personnel. We ought to issue a travel warning.
Is that a signal or a necessity out of safety? Like, what is the diplomatic point of doing that?
Inevitably, it's a signal, but you want to keep your people safe, so it's a signal you should be willing to send, yes.
All right, millions of people. I mean, you've got Seoul, just densely populated, within the reach. I mean, I know that they can reach the U.S. mainland, but it's easier to reach those things that are closer to North Korea.
Yeah, well, I don't think they can reach the U.S. mainland yet with nuclear weapons, and that's why the decision
testing is what I'm talking about.
Yeah, the decision time is very close, and I think it's our responsibility, if we use preemptive force against the nuclear program, to do everything we can to destroy that North Korean capacity to harm South Koreans. But let's also be clear. The responsibility of the President of the United States is to protect Americans. And that's ultimately what it has to come down to.
All right, drop the mic. Last word. Ambassador, thank you.
Thank you,
Good
Harris.
to see you.
Joining me now to address all of these questions and topics, John Bolton, former U.S. ambassador to the UN, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and a Fox News contributor. Thank you so much for being here today. We appreciate it.
Glad to be with you.
Now, we've been keeping an eye on the forum there in Simi Valley that brings together defense contractors, members of the administration to talk about military readiness. And we have the opportunity to listen to the National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, speak, as well as the interview with our own anchor, Brett Baer, the follow-up. He asked McMaster what the greatest threat facing America was. Not particularly shocking answer. He said North Korea. I'd also like to get your assessment on that.
Well, I think North Korea is part of it, but I think the threat as a whole, the strategic threat, is the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction more broadly. Including chemical and biological weapons. That's why I think President Trump's strike against the Assad regime in Syria for the use of chemical weapons was a very, very important aspect of this. And I frankly don't think you can divorce North Korea from Iran. I think cooperation between Iran and North Korea, historically on ballistic missiles and almost certainly on the nuclear side, puts them together. And it's part of a bigger strategic picture, and that is, if North Korea or Iran or both get a deliverable nuclear weapons capability, I'm afraid that decades of counterproliferation efforts led by the United States will have failed. And I think this will be a massive failure of American national security policy and presage proliferation of weapons of mass destruction to countless other countries. So this is not a one-off with North Korea. This is determining whether the 21st century, I think, will be a world where many, many more countries, dozens more countries, get nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, or whether we can draw the line here.
You know, as you're bringing that up, we just have some very recent reporting from our own national security correspondent, Jennifer Griffin, who also happens to be on the ground out there in California, speaking about this latest ballistic missile launch on the part of North Korea, and that it broke up on reentry. It's a hurdle they haven't been able to get past, one that apparently protects us, at least for now, from a warhead actually striking the continental United States. I mean, is there any relief in that, or do you think North Korea is actually getting very, very close, as we've seen them advance so rapidly recently?
No, I think General McMaster made the correct point that every launch brings them closer to the objective, whether every aspect of it succeeds or not. In the 1950s, when Vanguard and Jupiter C missiles were blowing up on launch pads in the United States, our rocket scientists, and they were rocket scientists, would describe these catastrophes as 90% successes. And the reason was that they had to know where the weak spots were in their science and their engineering. You know, it's not at all clear what was under the nose cone of the rocket on this most recent launch, and therefore we can't really tell what that implies once they put a thermonuclear warhead under it. So I think we've still got some time. I don't think that, for example, if we launched a preemptive strike against North Korea's nuclear program, that they could retaliate by hitting the United States with nuclear weapons. But our intelligence is imperfect. And that's why there is precious little time to make a decision whether there's any prospect of North Korea denuclearizing on its own or under Chinese pressure, or whether we're going to have to use military force. We can't blink at this any longer. That's the choice we're coming up to very, very rapidly.
Ambassador, something you just touched on briefly a moment ago when you talked about the proliferation of weapons around the world. McMaster talked about how all of these challenges have essentially brought our allies together, that now we're working to a greater degree with South Korea, with Japan. Is that something we're seeing on fronts all around the globe with rogue regimes, not just North Korea, but as you mentioned, Iran?
Well, I think the record here is divided. I mean, I think South Korea, for example, is very split internally on how to handle the North Korean threat. But let's not forget, just a few days before President Trump's recent Asia trip, Moon Jae-in, the president of South Korea, agreed with China on no further deployments of the THAAD air defense system, no trilateral cooperation with the U.S. and Japan on missile defense, and no trilateral defense alliance with Japan and the United States. Now, that's been his position for a long time. That's very dangerous.
All right, Ambassador, I hate to cut you off, but I'm getting a wrap here. Thank you so much for your insights.
Glad to be with you.
Now, let me just turn to the hard part here, and that is that I think the strategic circumstances in the Middle East today are getting more dangerous. I think even though the ISIS caliphate has all but fallen, that because of the strategy first adopted by the Obama administration of aiding the Baghdad government in substantial part, we aided others as well, the Kurds, parts of the Syrian opposition. At the end of the ISIS caliphate, unfortunately, the new shape of strategic reality in the Middle East is that Iran's influence has grown, and that it has created out of the ashes of the caliphate an arc of control stretching from its own territory through the Shia parts of Iraq controlled by the Baghdad government, linking up with the Assad regime in Syria and Hezbollah in Lebanon. We have reports just from last night that Israeli forces may have struck an Iranian base near Damascus, said to be a Syrian base, of course, but that's what's happened. The influence of Iran has grown as ISIS has been diminished. And that's a direct threat to Israel, it's a direct threat to America's Arab friends in the region. It is the beginning of the next struggle for hegemony geographically within the region between Iran and its surrogates on the one hand and the Sunni Arabs on the other. It's the struggle for hegemony within Islam that has gone on for centuries between Shia and Sunni. And I think it's one of the causes for the nuclear arms race that we see underway in the Mideast today, prompted in large part by this devastatingly bad nuclear deal that the Obama administration signed with Iran in 2015. All of these problems are now coming to bear on the Trump administration just 1 year in office, but nonetheless it's inheriting decades worth of issues. And although it may seem like a long way from the Middle East, I just want to stress why the president's decision on North Korea's nuclear weapons program will be so important. Because we are now, I think, at the stage where diplomacy, certainly with North Korea, has completely run its course. I suspect, I worry, I fear that diplomacy with China has run its course. And North Korea's progress in both ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons has gotten to the point where analysts all across our political spectrum believe that it's only a very short period of time before North Korea will be able to hit any target at once in the continental United States. Now, you know, when President George W. Bush referred to an axis of evil in the world, it wasn't just a literary metaphor. Iran and North Korea have cooperated on these issues for many, many years. North Korea sold Iran its first Scud missiles 25 years ago. They have worked together on ballistic missile developments ever since then. And why not? Because their objectives were the same, to put nuclear weapons under the nose cones of these missiles. This was not to launch weather satellites or communication satellites. So over the years, I think what North Korea learned, what Iran learned, they've shared together. And North Korea has simply demonstrated the extent to which its program has made progress more than Iran has. I think there's every reason to believe there's cooperation on the nuclear side as well. After all, their uranium enrichment technology for both of them was acquired by A.Q. Khan, the Pakistani nuclear entrepreneur who stole the designs from Urenco, the European uranium enrichment company. So their enrichment technologies have progressed together. A.Q. Khan sold them both their nuclear weapons designs, which he had stolen from Pakistan, which got them from China. We know that because another one of A.Q. Khan's customers was Libya. And when we got the Libyan nuclear weapons designs, they were written in Chinese. So that North Korea and Iran have a common enrichment technology, they have a common weapons design, and there's every reason to think that the cooperation on the nuclear front was demonstrated by the reactor in the Syrian desert that Israel destroyed in September of 2007. So we don't know. Our intelligence in North Korea is particularly poor. We don't know how much of the Iranian program may be in North Korea. So when you hear all this talk about verification and compliance with the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, just remember North Korea was not a party to it for good reason, but that much of what Iran is doing could well be done in conjunction with Pyongyang. And even beyond that, any technology, nuclear or ballistic missile, that North Korea has today, Iran can have tomorrow by writing a large enough check. Let me just spell it out. You know, in Iran, you have a rich, eager buyer for this technology. In North Korea, you have a poor, eager seller. Anybody having any trouble with the shape of this transaction? That's why we should not be diverted by minutiae about the Iran nuclear deal. The threat posed by North Korea is a global threat. It will sell anything it has to anybody. Iran, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, if they had hard currency, any aspiring nuclear power. So that the threat posed by North Korea is not just to South Korea, Japan, and the United States. It's a global threat. The way President Trump decides to handle that is going to be critical for how we deal with Iran and what I think would be the complete crash of counterproliferation policy worldwide. It won't just be Iran and North Korea that end up with nuclear weapons, but Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, and many, many others across the Middle East and beyond. So we're entering into a particularly dangerous period here for the administration, just 1 year into its tenure in office. And it's why people such as all of you in this room who care so much about Israel, about the U.S.-Israeli relationship, about the importance of strong national security policies to defend our innocent civilian populations against terrorists, whether they're suicide bombers or rogue states that seek to possess nuclear weapons. This is not the time to sit back. This is the time to redouble our efforts because really the future is in our hands. And the quality of the people in this room, I think, demonstrates why we have every reason to be hopeful if we stay strong and if we stay united. Thank you very much.
President Trump and Secretary of State Rex Tillerson naming North Korea a state sponsor of terrorism. President Trump arguing the Obama administration enabled Pyongyang's aggression, leading to the eventual death of American student Otto Warmbier and the assassination of leader Kim Jong-un's half-brother.
Today, the United States is designating North Korea as a state sponsor of terrorism. Should have happened a long time ago, should have happened years ago.
Critics denouncing the move as a needless provocation of the Hermit Kingdom. Some of those critics came from within the State Department, where there was apparently resistance to renaming North Korea a state sponsor of terror. Fox News contributor and former UN Ambassador John Bolton joins us live. Ambassador, good to have you with us tonight.
Glad to be with you.
What are these internal deliberations like? Because I know back in 2008, you didn't think they should come off the list.
Right. Look, in this instance, the State Department's kind of like a stuck record. They took North Korea off the list in 2008 to help induce North Korea to honor its commitments to denuclearize, commitments North Korea has made repeatedly over the past 25 years and repeatedly violated. So today, when somebody says, look, they were a terrorist state in 2008, they shouldn't have come off, we're going to put them back on for subsequent terrorist actions, the State Department can't handle it. And that's a real cultural problem, and it's not going to be solved simply by reorganization. I've said you need a cultural revolution at the State Department.
I want to play a little bit of what the Secretary of State had to say today about this decision.
It is very symbolic on the one hand because it just points out again what a rogue regime this is and how brutal this regime is and how little they care for the value of human life. The practical effects may be limited, but hopefully we're closing off a few loopholes with this.
Okay, so he referred to it as symbolic. He said the practical impact may be limited. So what are the practical impacts of putting someone back on this list?
Well, it does authorize additional sanctions, but I think it was a huge mistake for the Bush administration in 2008 to take them off as a political inducement for the nuclear negotiations. If this list is to mean anything, it means you have to be objective. If a state meets the qualifications to be a state sponsor of terrorism, you put it on the list whether you want to negotiate with them or not, and let their behavior change, not ours. So I think to say to the rest of the world, this is a terrorist regime, and therefore we don't believe them when they make commitments, as they've repeatedly demonstrated for 25 years, to denuclearize, because they're not going to do it.
Okay, so I know that you think that the president is missing an opportunity because a lot of the top positions at the State Department are not filled, and in many cases there's not even a nominee for these positions. We have some of these numbers. Our crack research team broke this down for us. 96, the number of unfilled positions. These are top positions. 73, there's not even a nominee. There's only 2 awaiting nomination and 21 awaiting confirmation. 1 has failed. We know that a lot of the people that are there then are still holdovers from the last administration. Here's what the president has said about the pressure to fill those positions.
Let me tell you, the one that matters is me. I'm the only one that matters because when it comes to it, that's what the policy is going to be.
All right, so how much does it matter that he get his senior position people filled?
Well, I think it matters a lot. Obviously, the president makes all the most serious decisions, but every day at the State Department and every other government department, dozens, hundreds of decisions are being made at lower levels that affect and constrain his options when big decisions finally get to him. I'll just speak from all my years in the bureaucracy. If a president doesn't push his nominees down as far as he can to the assistant secretary level, the deputy assistant secretary level, it's very hard to get control of a large bureaucracy, especially one that's culturally hostile to a conservative Republican point of view. So there are maybe 200 or 300 significant political appointments at the State Department. The total staff of the State Department worldwide is 70,000. So you're not saving a lot of money by not putting these top people in, and what happens is their positions are filled on an acting basis by career people. And what have the career people been doing the last 8 years? Following Obama administration policies. That you don't have to believe in conspiracy theories, you just have to believe in human nature, that somebody's going to continue the policies they've been following until somebody else tells them to change.
And quickly, Secretary Tillerson has downplayed any talk of a rift between these two or that they're not on the same page. What's your sense of the relationship?
Well, I think it's always difficult when you have people who come from very different backgrounds, neither one of whom has been in the government before. But I do think it's critical in the national security area that everybody speak with one voice, and that means the interagency process, a boring phrase, but a critical process, has to work. And I don't think it has worked as well as it needs to in a threatening environment such as we live in internationally today.
It is no joke on multiple fronts. Ambassador, great to have you with us.
Glad to be here.
Thanks for coming in.
And we're back with Senator Lindsey Graham. Senator, before we get to North Korea, one more question on this investigation. The New York Times reported this week the president had made some calls up to the Hill about these investigations into Russian interference. Was that appropriate for him to make those phone calls?
I don't know what the content was, but he's never asked me to stop an investigation. Yeah, it would be inappropriate for the president to say, stop the investigation. It's not inappropriate to have a discussion in general. Again, I just want people to understand Mike Flynn would know if there was collusion, in my view, between the Trump campaign and the Russians. There's no evidence of collusion yet. Nobody's been charged with collusion. The Manafort lawyer said there was no collusion. But if there was, Flynn would know, and we're going to know pretty soon one way or the other.
But on the larger question, you're not saying it's only about collusion, because there is this obstruction of justice question, which is quite important, and lying to the FBI.
A completely different, but that's not my focus right now.
Sure, I understand. Yeah. But I'm saying in general, that's not, absolutely. We don't want to overlook that. North Korea. Where are we with North Korea right now?
We're getting close to a military conflict because North Korea is marching toward marrying up the technology of an ICBM with a nuclear weapon on top that can not only get to America but deliver the weapon. We're running out of time. McMaster said that yesterday. I'm going to urge the Pentagon not to send any more dependents to South Korea. South Korea should be an unaccompanied tour. It's crazy to send spouses and children to South Korea given the provocation of North Korea. So I want them to stop sending dependents, and I think it's now time to start moving American dependents out of South Korea.
How close? You say we're getting close to military confrontation. What are we talking about here?
The intelligence community can tell you that better than I can, but I had an extensive discussion with the administration about this topic. The policy of the Trump administration is to deny North Korea the capability to hit America with a nuclear-tipped missile, not to contain it. Denial means preemptive war as a last resort. That preemption is becoming more likely as their technology matures. Every missile test, every underground test of a nuclear weapon means the marriage is more likely. I think we're really running out of time. The Chinese are trying, but ineffectively. If there's an underground nuclear test, then you need to get ready for a very serious response by the United States.
Should the Congress be having a big open conversation about preemptive war?
Yeah, I think so. I think the President, as inherent authority as Commander-in-Chief, has the ability to strike North Korea to protect the American homeland. But this discussion needs to happen among ourselves.
Let me ask you about the President's team. There were a lot of back and forth this week about whether Secretary of State Tillerson was going to stay in the job. Do you, net, after all the reports and so forth is over, do you have confidence in the President's team around him to manage this tricky question?
He's got the best national security team of anybody I've seen since I've been in Washington. The President himself early on made the right decision. I'm not going to allow North Korea to hit America with a nuclear weapon. We're not going to live under that threat. If I have to go to war and I don't want to stop it, I will. Everybody before President Trump screwed it up, including Republicans. Now we need to get it right, and I think he's got the right approach. He's got the right team. I hope China will help us. We're running out of time.
All right, and we have run out of time, Senator. Thank you so much for being with us, and we'll be back in a moment.
If war does come, it will be because of continued acts of aggression like we witnessed yesterday. And if war comes, make no mistake, the North Korean regime will be utterly destroyed.
Very strong words today from U.S. Ambassador Nikki Haley at the United Nations just a short time ago, as the threat of a North Korean missile hitting the United States comes much closer to reality. The rogue regime's latest intercontinental ballistic missile puts really our entire country within the target. Take a look at this map. You've got 33 minutes to Los Angeles, 37 to 38 to Chicago, 38 to 39 minutes from launch time to hitting New York City. So joining me now, Senator Lindsey Graham, who sits on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Senator, good to have you with us tonight. Always a pleasure to hear from you. What do you think? You know, the president has said that he will take care of it. Those were the words that he used when he saw this missile launch. What do you think he means by that?
He's telling China and the world at large, if you don't stop North Korea, I will. Now, what would trigger a war? The day the president believes that the North Koreans have the capability to launch an ICBM with a nuclear weapon on top that can actually hit America, he's never going to let that day happen. So his policy is to deny the North Korean regime the ability to hit America with a nuclear weapon, and we'll go to war to stop that. So what he's telling China is if you don't change North Korea's behavior regarding their missile program and their nuclear program, I will preemptively attack North Korea and destroy their regime. You see all these graphs about our backyard? Somebody needs to give a graph to China about what happens in their backyard if we attack North Korea.
Yeah, I mean, they're aware of that, right? They know that they would have a huge refugee problem flooding across their borders. It's clearly something that they don't want. But you don't think what?
I don't think they believe it because there's one of two things going on. North Korea is not paying attention to what China is saying, or China is not saying what they need to be saying. All I know is that China is the key to this. All the oil that North Korea uses to run their economy comes from China. They could bring the North Korean economy to their knees tomorrow if they chose to. Trump's got to convince the Chinese that he's deadly serious about a preemptive attack against North Korea, that we're not going to live our lives as Americans under a nuclear threat from a crazy man in North Korea. And if there's going to be a war to stop this threat, it's going to be in China's backyard, not America's backyard. And he needs to deliver that message to the Chinese without any equivocation, and I think he has.
Senator Lindsey Graham, thank you very much, sir. Good to talk to you tonight.